Welcome everybody to Bill English Opens the Books, the first in what we intend to be a series of leaders talking about literature. This, as will be explained later, is slightly harder than you might think. But there are several other events on in Wellington tonight, and we thank you for choosing this one. I want to acknowledge the presence of the Mayor of Wellington, Justin Lester, himself an arts graduate. The Wellington City Council supports Katherine Mansfield House Garden with a triennial grant, and the Mayor's personal support has been steadfast and is much appreciated. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of the Chief Justice, Dame Sian Elias. If we had the Speaker here, we'd have the three branches of government. So there you go. Marsden Mansfield's alma mater has been wonderfully generous, as has Euro Vintage, Fine Cuisine and Flight Deck, who have contributed to the food, wine and publicity for tonight. Finally, I'd like to thank the House and Garden small, hard-working voluntary board, Jack Toohey, Sheridan Bruce, Byron Roth, Margaret Dean, Ian McKinnon and Brenda Pilot. Also, three women co-opted onto the organising committee for this event, Catherine Carmody, Mary Toohey and Judith Langridge. And I'd also like to thank the director of the House and Garden, Jen Boland, for all she's done. This is the launch of a fundraising campaign for the House and Garden. Next year it will be 30 years since it opened as a house museum dedicated to celebrating the life and work of Katherine Mansfield. On a practical level, there is deferred maintenance to attend to, a garden wall to be rebuilt after last November's earthquake, and a collection that needs rest and repair. We'd also like to enhance our educational and creative offering. We need to improve access for the disabled and also provide assistance to schools that find it financially challenging to visit. We already run a short story competition for secondary schools in Wellington and the Wairarapa, and we would like to extend its reach. We'd also like to celebrate our 30th anniversary by publishing the first Mansfield story in Te Reo. Yeah, hasn't been done. Interesting. Katherine Mansfield, early in this country's European history, took on the world of letters. Since her death at the age of 34, her work has never been out of print. There are no fewer than 8 biographies of her, and counting. She is studied and written about by an international community now more than ever. In short, she is utterly relevant. When we celebrate her, we celebrate originality and creativity, all of which, if genuine, transcends time. When researching for this evening, I made many discoveries. Who knew that an early premier, Alfred Domet, was a poet boasting 2 published volumes? That his grandnephew was the poet Ernest Dowson, who gave us the phrase, "the days of wine and roses"? Who knew that Jack Marshall wrote a series of children's books titled Dr. Duffer? Given that my father once attended Marshall in a medical capacity in, of all places, Tehran, it is possible for me to take that title somewhat personally. But research proved our current Prime Minister is the only one in our history to have an honours degree in English literature, first class, and I ask you to join me in welcoming him to the stage to talk about this and other related matters. Right, are you plugged in?
Am I plugged in? Yeah.
Good. This isn't going to be difficult. I want you to talk about your earliest memories of enjoying reading and stories, just to start with.
Well, probably the sort of fondest memory I have of that was that my mother read us the whole Narnia series.
Oh, yeah.
Which was a remarkable achievement in a busy household of 12 children. And I can remember sitting around, I can't remember the age, we must have been young, but quite a large group of children.
So, like, quite an age range there, in terms of who were the listeners?
Well, yes, that's right. But,
Yeah.
I can remember being just entranced by The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe.
Yeah, yeah.
And couldn't believe it when they made it into a movie. It was great.
There were several attempts to make it into movies, but the most recent ones were good. So were books important in your family?
Yes, they were. My parents were amazingly eclectic readers. So I was in a household that had everything from sort of late or early 1900s English books on organic farming and self-contained environmental systems. There was a particular author called George Henderson that we used to hear about all the time, through to G.K. Chesterton, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. They were they were very broad, deep readers. I don't know how they got the time, but they did it.
I'm wondering.
Just to give you an indication of it, I can recall coming in from farming, from the sheepyards at morning tea time, and my father would be reading L'Osservatore Romano, which is the newspaper of the Vatican.
Right. So the Englishes are Irish, right?
Yes.
I love that. But so do you think, it's a cliche, but the land of poets and priests, do you think there is something? It's interesting that John Ballance, who is another Prime Minister who was really well known for his love of reading, was Irish. Do you think there's something in that, or do you think that's just a stereotype you'd like to forget about?
There's a particular family story that makes it relevant, I suppose, and that is that we were brought up with the slightly demeaning story that the name English came from Ireland because when the invaders turned up, a whole lot of the locals just changed their name to English.
Are you kidding me?
But then I read a more refined and sophisticated version of it, which was that the original name was O'Reilly, but they were a family who became translators between English and
Gaelic.
And that's why the name caught on as the people who could speak English.
Oh, wow.
Which is the version that I much prefer.
Yeah, I'd take that if I were you. So your siblings, obviously you were a reading family, and did your siblings put literature in front of you that was important? Did you kind of copy them?
Well, I suppose the reading habits were patchy. We all developed a bit of a habit because going to school was a bit of an expedition. We used to bike 4 miles to the school bus stop, and then we were on the bus for about 40 minutes going to the Catholic school in Winton. So you had that time on the bus every day, both ways, and if you didn't want to attract the attention of the college students, who in those days were a bit less civil than they are now, then you were best to have your head down in a book.
Right.
And so we all did that. And yes, my siblings read, probably not quite as much as I did. So
did any of other siblings study literature, or?
Yes, they did. I think one of them actually got a degree in English. She's just finished teaching it for she's been teaching it for 40 years, I think, just retired after 30 years at St Oran's. And they all had a general love of it, although no one quite, I don't think, studied it. No one did the sort of 4-year version I did.
And were there any teachers that were important? Because I often think teachers can be a real agent for a love of literature.
Yes, they can. Well, my education was through the Catholic system, and of course it's a great literary tradition and interpretive tradition. It's just full of stories, very old stories, going right back 5,000 years. So in that sense you're brought up in a tradition of the book. And I was fortunate to have at primary school some intellectually demanding nuns teaching me, when we used to have nuns, Sister Gregory, Sister Mary Joan, I think it was, and they just keep pushing stuff at you. So I found myself at the age of 12 reading Cancer Ward by Solzhenitsyn.
The nuns were giving you that?
Yes.
Wow.
Well, I had the butcher, they said, bring to school some books you think you wouldn't understand. So I bought a few of them, War and Peace, because these were at home, and they said, well, you have to read those and come back and tell us. And then in the secondary school, the Marists, actually up here at Silver Street, and of course they had this strong sense of ownership of James K. Baxter. And one of the rectors at St Pat's Town had done an edition of James
Frank
K.
Mackay.
Baxter. It was Frank Mackay and John, I can't remember his last name, John Weir. So these were very well educated people, and greatly encouraged me. I do remember a particular English teacher, Jim Moriarty, and I don't know of him since
actor.
he left. No, he'd be a lot older than that one.
That Jim Moriarty, yeah.
But just one of the sort of an aesthetic type who had an extraordinary focus on the value of literature, and I think I had him in sixth form, and I think that was probably where I really got hold of an interest in it.
Okay, so because we've moved into this, I was going to say, if you bring in Cancerwood to your primary school, I mean, I was just going to ask you about the books you read as an adolescent. They often you're trying to define what kind of adult you want to be, or define what an adult is by those books. And I'm just wondering, did you have a sort of Catcher in the Rye moment, or what books were really significant to you then?
At that time? Actually, that's an interesting question, because I'm one of these readers who forgets most things that I read. I think that's normal.
Yeah.
If I can think of, actually, one book that had a big impact on me, which was non-fiction, was the book about Charles Upham.
Oh, right.
The Mark of the Lion. And I don't know why, I probably read it about 6 times. That great thing that kids have where they go back and read it again. When you're a child, 3-year-old, you can do it 40 times.
Yes.
And as you get a bit older, you get down to 2 or 3 times.
Yeah.
But look, I just remember reading everything, whatever was in the English syllabus, with just the usual diet, really, of what you did in the 1970s in secondary school.
I mean, often I think at that stage of your life, pop music and the lyrics of pop music can kind of often read like literature. Were you musical? Were you interested in, the lyrics of the music you were listening to, or?
No, unfortunately not musical at all, but very fortunately all of my children are, and they've all, as my wife is, because of Mary, and they've all taken instruments or singing through to quite high levels. But I just listened to the the kind of the pop music, and I used to like the Split Enz lyrics a lot, but I wouldn't say they were hugely influential.
Wasn't like
I wasn't
Dylan or Bob Dylan or...
Well, I had these siblings on each side of me who were pretty intensive music types. So whatever I listened to was from them. And of course all these older siblings who had... So sitting around in the house would be these LPs, I suppose they were, of all the stuff of the 60s and 70s, because my older siblings were teenagers in the 60s.
Yes.
And so it was all there,
Yeah.
and I just probably was a bit more interested in the books. But I do remember at secondary school a couple of things that had an impact on me. One was T.S. Eliot, which was taught in sixth form, I think, and I still go back and look at that, and I often think good literature is wasted on youth. How can you understand something like T.S. Eliot or a whole lot of other things when you're under 50?
I know what you mean.
I suppose
certainly I'm aware that a lot of the time you can read things, and I mean, when you go back to them as an older person, it's an entirely different kind of experience, isn't it?
And that's, I think, the point. I really enjoy going back to look at some of the things I read as a young person, because they're just so much like Katherine Mansfield, just so much more subtlety and complexity that you completely miss when you're a 19-year-old male.
But then why? But then what? You were still interested then in reading and in literature, even though, looking back on it, it was a sort of quite a thin gruel you were getting, comparatively.
Well, it was, I wouldn't say a thin gruel. I was surrounded by ideas, whether it was at school or at home, where my parents were, quite intellectual people with this incredible range of stuff that they would discuss at any given time. And so actually after I left school I went home. I did have a bit of a seed in my head about doing further study because I got what was then scholarship, probably the only farm worker in New Zealand with a scholarship that year. And I then decided, and this was a bit of a challenge, having to explain to my rugby club that I was going off to university to study English literature, which I did.
And what did they say?
Not much.
Right.
What could you say?
You could say what my father said to me when I said I was going to do a degree in English literature. He said, Nicky, most people do that reading in their spare time. Do economics. Which...
I did succumb somewhat to the pressure where I went there to study English literature and I thought, well, I may as well do something useful, and actually when you look at the timetables, it looked to me to be a fair bit of spare time. So I did accounting on the way through.
Okay, so I want to talk about that. So at Otago you did a BCom and a BA at the same time. Is that right? Or
Yes, that's right.
and then you decided to do postgrad, and you went to Victoria. So you moved, but you decided to do postgrad in English literature. So that's when you're sort of shaping a career for most people. It's kind of, things are firming up a bit. So why you opted for that?
Well, there's a
rather
slightly
than the other.
sort of a torturous artiste explanation for that.
Oh, hear it.
Which is, I blame entirely on my wife. So I had left Otago University where I had some fantastic teachers of literature, particularly Dr. Alistair Fox, who sort of the Renaissance expert, and really enjoyed that. Then went farming in Dipton in Southland. I had got engaged to Mary, who went off to Wellington to finish her training as a doctor.
Right.
So I pined away in the fields for 2 years. I think it must have been 2 or 3 years. And then decided actually this wasn't a very smart way to run a relationship. So I caved in and went to Wellington. And you can understand why a young woman doctor might find Dipton wasn't conducive to her career. So when I got here, it was a bit of a challenge. I mean, I came literally out of the sheepyards in my HT Holden to sweep up my lovely lady, and got here and found that the only jobs I could really get were auditing jobs, because I did have a very straightforward BCom in accounting. I was not brilliant at it. And decided, after having a look around and with a bit of pressure from my Samoan father-in-law to-be, who felt that I needed to be employed in a way that was worthy of his number one daughter, decided I needed an honours degree to get into the policy world. So I thought, well, what's the best way to make sure I get an honours degree? I'll do English literature, because I thought I'd get the best marks in that. So I walked pretty much out of the farm and into this class, an honours class in Victoria, and it was a fantastic intellectual experience, because I walked in with this group of people who shared none of the assumptions I had about life or literature. Some of them you've heard of. Elizabeth Knox was in the class, John Campbell, Paul Holmes, and we had a fantastic bunch of sort of difficult, irritable, slightly irascible teachers.
Like who were? Can you name names?
Oh, well, I can remember most of them actually. And so probably the one I've kept in contact with, Brian Opie, who founded the Academy for Humanities, Linda Hardy, who was there, Roger Robinson, David Norton, who at the time we didn't get on that well actually, and then I discovered he's done his own version, the only other next edition of the King James Bible, which is an extraordinary intellectual feat, which he must have been working through while we were there.
He didn't talk about it.
Didn't talk about it. We sparred over D.H. Lawrence. So it was a fantastic experience. Professor Stuart Johnson, Andrew Johnson's father, Andrew's done some poetry, who was at secondary school with me.
What were the most enjoyable papers?
Well, actually, I got really into literary criticism. I mean, I enjoyed the reading was fantastic. I did, and it was sort of the standard fare of courses. And some of them I really liked. Thomas Hardy, I think partly because of the rural base, actually, of a lot of what he wrote, and his influence on other writers. John Milton, so Paradise Lost, so I think was probably my specialty. I learnt more religion from being taught Paradise Lost, more about Catholicism by being taught by a secularist, Brian Opie, on a Protestant writer, and also about English history and political history. I mean, it's just a fantastic treasure trove of everything you can imagine, from descriptions of narcissism through to the sort of cosmology of the time. And then alongside that, the literary criticism, which was incredibly intellectually challenging. So this is a little, farm boy from Southland, and we're getting pushed into, sort of submerged in postmodernism, Marxist, feminist criticism, semiotics, Foucault, Derrida, Kristeva, stuff you could hardly read a sentence of and make sense of when you get started. But I'd found that incredibly challenging and worthwhile. And it did tempt me for a while to go down the academic track. Well,
yeah. And so what happened to that?
Well, I certainly got good enough marks. What I did, it was just a lot of the criticism stuff. In fact, it was the best political education I've had. Right?
So tell us about that.
Well, just because all the analysis that was applied to the kind of, depending on which theories you picked, Foucault's stuff on madness is all about definitions of what's normal and what's not normal and how that gets decided. The kind of analysis of power as it's expressed in literature, the sort of slipperiness of meaning, how difficult it is to establish exactly what people mean. But in the end, I decided I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time studying ways of saying stories meant nothing. Okay? Well, that's kind of what it came down to, that nothing is what it looks like, which I thought was contradicted by our everyday experience, because our everyday experience is that stories are incredibly powerful. Not just the high literature, but just day-to-day stories. You stand in front of a crowd, there's 150 novels here. These are powerful stories. And so I thought, I sort of flirted with that and then thought, I better go and get a job. So I found myself working in the Treasury as a junior advisor to Roger Douglas. And if you wanted to study in how power structures work, well, that was a pretty immediate one, because I'd come out of a community which had been deeply traumatised by economic change.
So you were in Treasury. I'm just trying to work this out. Roger Douglas, what position did he?
He was the finance minister.
He was. Okay, so he was the finance minister.
Yes, I was a diversity hire in Treasury. Well, they were getting a hard time for only recruiting rationalists and economists, and so in my intake there was a French graduate, a philosophy graduate, and I was the token English graduate. And so I know what tokenism feels like.
So what do you think is the thinking behind the diversity hire?
Well, they were just under pressure to hire some people who didn't have economics degrees, and I did.
But I mean, Treasury actually has quite a long history of since Henry Lang, of having people with classics degrees and things like that. Do you think that's what do you think is the idea? But apart from pressure groups, is there another reason?
Well, I presume. I mean, you can learn economics out of the newspaper, right? It's not a
right.
And it's basically a pretty simple science. Well, it's not really a science. It's kind of a set of stories that do explain quite a lot of things. I mean, it's got a powerful explanatory tool. So you're working in a political economy. So it's an environment where decisions get made as a result of an intellectual process, and it's good if those things can be joined together. And people who I think have the kind of education I have are much better able to do that. In fact, I would, in my view, they should hire humanities graduates not of the postmodern sort who think nothing means anything, because that's pretty pointless, but of the sort that understand how stories work and how effective they can be at shaping perception. Now that can be used for good or evil, but it's an amazing skill. If you can tell a story, whether you're an economist or a scientist or a politician or a teacher or a parent,
it's relatable. Yeah.
Or people know what you mean. It's an incredibly deeply set instinct, the story.
Yeah. So a reader is a writer turned inside out. Have you written poetry or prose yourself?
No. This is one of the reasons I think I did get really interested in reading was to try and discover the secret of writing, and I haven't discovered it yet. I see people writing books, and I think I just don't have that much to say. And you read, any kind of amazing descriptive prose from Katherine Mansfield through to Don DeLillo, and you think, how do they just see all that and then find words for it that aren't repetitive or oversimplified or glib?
Well, I was interested because I'm interested in what has captured you about literature. Is it content or is it actually language? That's why I asked you about being musical, because I tend to think that language, the voice is an instrument, and language is can be a musical composition, really. So, and I think writing, it's the sound of words often, isn't it, that captures people, and the way they work together or don't work together.
Well, you get yes. I think the language is just so. It's so powerful, and actually, it's one of the fundamental skills of good politics.
Yeah,
is the precision with which you can use it in a way that limits or multiplies meaning. And that's quite it's a daily challenge in our business. But with respect to writing, it's a bit like the music. I can write, a kind of discursive short column pretty quickly about a non-fiction title. But I'm fortunate to have children who can write. So Maria, who went here, is a very beautiful writer. And we have a son who's about to publish his 3rd volume of poetry. And if I can just get him to sort out his marketing plan a bit more, you will hear about it. Which has and what annoys me about that is the brilliant ease with which he does it. So he works with Joy Cowley, and she says we need 60 poems, so he writes 61. And it appears to be effortless, and I admire it because he's the only teenager I've seen write that's not about teenage angst, which is pretty impressive. But look, I have an interest in the history of language, so I'm fortunate enough to have done sort of Anglo-Saxon, Middle English, Chaucer, Latin, through to sort of modern technological language. Now, that's all just a kind of intellectual smattering. I wouldn't call it anything more than that, but it does give you it's given me a pretty amazing view of how a language evolves. How language evolves over time and the different ways in which the same words are used.
Right. What's your favourite Shakespearean play?
King Lear. Not quite sure why.
Okay, I was going to say
I saw a fantastic version of it at Circa last year with Ray Henwood, and it sort of comes alive. The performance matters. Hearing T.S. Eliot read his own poetry is incredible. It just changes your whole perception of the depth of it. And I've listened to various recordings at different times of Paradise Lost. So the performance matters. So, look, I find Shakespeare hard, like everyone else does. Yeah. Well, maybe I'm the only one. And that's one of my favourites. I've enjoyed coaching my kids on Shakespeare. Well, they're doing NCA and all that sort of stuff. They with boys, because they've got 5 boys. 3 sentences on Hamlet, that'll get them through.
So give them to us.
Indecision. That's all you need to know. I don't have to read it.
Play about doing nothing, not doing anything really. So, isn't it? It's kind of like,
and being worried about it.
Yeah, really stressing about it.
If you're going to do nothing, you may as well just
so
be happy.
Your favourite male character in Shakespeare?
My favourite male character? Oh, well, it's Hamlet. I mean, it's
Hamlet, right.
Yeah, that's why everyone knows about him.
And female character?
Oh, the favourite female character. Well, you have to really go to the comedies to get nice ones. Oh, look, there's real depth there. I mean, I think the Regan and Goneril, Lady Macbeth, these are hard-edged people.
Have you would have seen House of Cards?
I've seen most of it, or bits of it.
Don't you think that Claire Underwood, is a combination of Lady Macbeth and another, she really is?
Well, this is the problem. Well, yes, she is, and brilliantly acted. I just always feel sort of slightly guilty by association watching a political program like that. Keep trying to say to people, it's not really like that. That's not how it works.
Today of all days. But on that note, I was going to ask you, what work of fiction would you recommend to aspiring politicians?
Oh, I don't know if politicians read much. I mean,
I was going to ask that. Is there a parliamentary book club, or do your colleagues, chat about books at all? Or
no, there's a parliamentary library, which doesn't necessarily get used that much. Not for fiction, anyway. Well, actually, if they really want to learn about politics, I mean, this is the hard way. It's read Paradise Lost. I mean, it is just a fantastic mythology, allegory, and actually kind of reality, if you think of them just as characters contending over the meaning of good and evil, which a fair bit of politics is about. You can learn from that.
Desert Island books, apart from the Bible and the complete works of Shakespeare, what 3 books would you take with you?
Which 3?
3.
I'd take long ones. That's for sure. Middlemarch.
Yeah.
I'll take that. I've read that a couple of times. Really like it. Actually, and well, it depends what you're trying to, whether you're trying to entertain yourself or get something you can read a number of times. So that would be one. Don DeLillo, Underworld. It's one of my favourite books. It's just it's a strange story, but a fantastic one. Actually, the other political book people should read is his book about the assassination of JFK. Just because it tells you a whole lot about kind of real, well, they're not real in the sense they're fictional characters, but the way that people get ideas in their heads about politics and how they can change the direction of things when they're not the politician. Because politicians read books about other politicians, you read all about Tony Blair or Bill Clinton or
biographies and things.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Not many people write about an ordinary person's experience and getting motivated enough to shoot a president takes a bit of doing, but it's a fantastic book. So Middlemarch I would take. War and Peace, just because it's long, but also because the great thing, Tolstoy can write about happiness, and not many people can. And it's kind of a rural sort of happiness. So I suppose it relate to that. But he also writes about a lot of sadness as well. Yeah. But that's another big thick one. I would not take James Joyce. You never didn't know? I never really got hold of it, I have to say. Maybe I was too young. Maybe I should go back to it now.
Yeah. Do you read for just for pleasure? Do you read good rubbish, like good crime fiction or anything like that? Do you have a sort of pleasure of just escapist kind of stuff? Nothing too literary.
Well, it has to be well done. So Robert Ludlum, I've always found great escapism, just because he does it well. It's not just kind of churning out thrillers like some of them seem to do.
John le Carre? John le Carre's good.
Yeah, well, he's just not quite my taste.
Yeah, okay.
I don't get a lot of time for the. I have to be pretty discriminating about reading for pleasure. So sometimes I just ask people. So, and it's always good to have other people who read interesting stuff. in your life. So one person I talk about books a bit to is Joanne Black, who writes in The Listener, who worked for me for a while.
She reads a lot. Yeah.
She reads a lot of books, and she referred me to this one called The Angle of Repose, which I finished this year. It took a bit of doing. Just a fantastic novel based on letters, real letters of a real woman who went from the East Coast into basically the Wild West in the US, which I think was, and actually made me think I should go and look and see who's written the New Zealand equivalent of the pioneer story, but in a more kind of modern, ironic tone, rather than the kind of jolly adventure of it all, which I always find a bit hard, to deal with.
Yeah.
Sorry, you got me off on a topic there.
No, that's absolutely fine. Obviously, you've got it sussed in terms of reading, but the OECD considers reading for pleasure to be the most important indicator for the future success of a child, more important than the education of parents or social class or family size or anything like that. So do you think enough is being done to engender a kind of that in our population?
Well, look, I'm sure we could say no, and we've always said that about our young people, haven't they? They don't do enough of whatever it is that older people think makes them virtuous, and that hasn't changed for a few thousand years. With having spent a bit of time with kids over the years, as long as they can able to follow their natural curiosity, and it's one of the challenges, I think, if I might say so, here for our secondary schools, is that if they're unable to follow their natural curiosity, then reading will almost certainly be part of that. And I've learned, particularly with boys, that they go through phases. There'll be a phase where you think they never read a thing, and then, man, they just come out with this stuff, and you think, where did that come from? Sometimes they just need to get a bit older and kind of get through their computer game phase, where actually they learn a whole set of skills
the
there.
Fantasy phase, which seem to go on, there's a lot of boys seem to really enjoy the sort of fantasy stuff.
It's great, and I don't mind what it is so long as they read it.
So did you have time to read to your children?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, knowing this was coming up, I asked them, trying to remember, and so we read a lot of the things you'd expect: Aesop's Fables, Hans Christian Andersen stuff. I got this book from somewhere. Someone gave it to us called The Book of Virtues, which was sort of a compendium of stories about people who did good things. And then my kids reminded me that actually a lot of the time I used to make the stories up.
You did?
Yeah.
I always found that really hard. I just get stuck.
But what it was interesting. Yeah, well, that's because you have to let your mind loose. Because the kids don't have conditioned expectations, particularly when a parent's doing it. They're really on your side.
Yeah.
Right. In a book, they have expectations. It's meant to be. I always told my kids, there's only 2 stories ever written: love and redemption. That's it. Every story fits into one of those boxes, even children's stories. And so they have an expectation about that. But if you're just making it up in a kind of loosely associated way, and some of the stuff they mentioned to me in the last week, I think, where did that come from? I can't remember it, but
they remembered them.
They remembered some of the metaphors and basic plot lines and things. So that's not too bad. I thought they hadn't listened to anything I'd said, that they only ever listened to their mother.
Is there anything else that you'd like to say about literature and reading? And we're going to get questions from the floor after this.
I've probably said enough. Let's go to some questions from the floor.
Okay. Who's got the roving mic? Right. Is there anybody who'd like to ask a question? Oh, come on, guys.
Harry Potter.
I've never read any Harry Potter, but my kids have read everything, and I just think my children, who are aged 29 down to 17, have been really lucky to have fantastic storytellers, including a New Zealand version of Lord of the Rings. So between Harry Potter, and the films of Lord of the Rings, it's been, I think, a gift to them compared to the generation before, because these are magical stories that caught kids' imaginations, and I'm sure got a whole generation reading more who may not have otherwise done so.
For sure, yeah.
And of course there's lots of derivatives of it, and that's all pretty good as well. One of our kids used to they'd watch Lord of the Rings, and then they'd go out and act it out for hours, bouncing on the trampoline with their arrows on their back and their bow, and playing about 5 different parts at once.
Yeah. Question here?
Mike Moore recommended a book to me once, and Jack Marshall another. They were fabulous books of great moments of history, and they were well read, well travelled. Political history, great movers and shakers. You got something that comes along?
Oh, you mean of a political nature? Yeah. I'm sort of interested in, the personalities always tell the story the way they think it should have been. And so you've always got to have a bit of a discount factor. And politicians, of course, we're interested in books. So the book about the first Bill Clinton campaign is a classic. The books about... there's a series by Robert Caro about Lyndon Baines Johnson, which for any politician in the world is just a junkie's paradise of sort of detailed deceit, duplicity, and deals, and ultimately success. This is the guy who got the Civil Rights Act passed, and it explains how such a devious, distrusted person actually managed to do an amazing thing. So there's hope for all of us politicians, isn't there? And in Michael King's New Zealand history is really good. Actually, there's a book I launched just a wee while ago, a book of New Zealand Prime Ministers by Michael Bassett, which is very accessible. And my favourite book in that respect is actually about J.G. Ward, Sir Joseph Ward, who was the previous Prime Minister from Southland. His parents ran the pub in Bluff, and he had the good fortune to, in his death, to be injected with champagne as he went, because it was apparently something that was meant to help him. But he had a fantastic story of that sort of captures the development of New Zealand, but in a kind of rollicking Irish way. And I wish I'd met the guy.
Right. The others.
There was one down here, I think.
Was there?
Yeah, sorry. I was thinking about the rural side of things, and I'm a farmer's boy as well, I'm from the UK. But you mentioned Thomas Hardy. It seems that we've got a deficit in New Zealand of rural literature, and there's a Peter Carter conventionalism, which also I've faced as well as a farmer's boy in the UK. I wonder whether you've got any sort of views on that, and how we can get the next great rural saga from the New Zealand experience.
Look, that's an interesting point, because we've got the man alone syndrome, haven't we? Which is that it's the artistic expressions of what was life for most New Zealanders has been kind of inherently depressing and largely about isolation, sort of spiritual isolation, if not actual. I was just saying to Mary on the way in, the one book I read by Lawrence Fernley, who wrote a sort of a farm story based in Mossburn, which is just over the hill from my home. I recognised the landscapes as she described them, which was the only one I've actually read as an adult, which I thought was sort of reflective, but even then it was pretty, a bit depressing. As someone said to me, I wish these people would write books as if they liked the country instead of as if they disliked it. So I'm not quite sure where it's going to come from. I think a thing to remember about New Zealand is we are the most recently settled island on Earth, with been the most rapidly transformed physical environment on Earth, and our history is raw. It's still raw. And whether that's the kind of the anti-intellectualism that is in a very raw environment, people reacted to that. People were not in amongst the kind of discussion and debate which shapes intellectual history. They were literally out in the paddock chopping trees down and chasing animals around. So that takes time to develop, in the sense that you might, in a sort of a hardy world, there actually were intellectual people around, because they were thousands-year-old civilisations. We are an extremely young civilisation. That's one aspect of it. And the other is, just through a lot of New Zealand, the conflict with Māori over land is really only just settling. Literally settling in a legal sense. But so you can go to a lot of places and people are uneasy about the historical underlay of whatever that saga might be.
What, you mean the narratives that kind of describe it in a way? Because that's conflicted.
It's conflicted, yeah. So you have a bit less of the kind of grandness that you
confidence
might get, and the confidence that you get. I think there's probably. I think it'll happen. It's just not. The time clearly hasn't arrived yet. I mean, the test is: has it happened? Answer: no. There might be reasons. I've given you a couple of hypotheses about it, and maybe someone will get to do it. But we are just so young.
Right. Down here. Do you want to...
Well, first of all, congratulations to KMHT for your initiative about participating in Katherine Mansfield House Garden.
Yeah.
Thumbs up on that.
Can't believe it hasn't been done.
Prime Minister, this is rather an unformed question, but can you imagine a future or have a vision where Te Reo Māori is a celebrated part of New Zealand's literature and how we develop into the future?
Yes, I can imagine that, and I think a number of the components of that are there, and you're seeing it in music, for instance. I think, and in increasingly in filmmaking. You know, it's just great to see. In fact, most of the better New Zealand films, oddly enough, all come from the East Coast and the North Island. You know, Dark Horse, Whale Rider, Boy, and so it's been that I think that process has been about not just the Māori content, but also the kind of warm irony of the people, which some of our filmmakers, Taika Waititi being the best, can just capture. I don't know how they do it, because it looks very difficult. With respect to the literature, of course, it's a matter of the how widely Te Reo disseminates, and that process. In fact, we've spent quite a lot of time thinking about this in recent years. There's a new Māori language strategy, which was all based on the idea that while government has treaty obligations to foster it, you know, TV channels and things, the owners of it actually are the speakers of it, not the government officials. And so we've got to have a bit more. We're going to have two pillars to this, not just one, because government of itself is not actually able, other than in symbolic ways, to disseminate the actual language. So I think that will develop. However far the Te Reo actually goes, I think that New Zealand culture is, as I mentioned with the films, being significantly influenced by sort of Māori ways of seeing the world, and increasingly Pacific ways of seeing the world. And one of the interesting things out ahead of us is how the sort of Chinese, Indian, South Asian populations, which will be almost as big, what is their sort of external cultural representation in New Zealand. Because at the moment it's kind of lantern festivals, but they have very deep, sophisticated literary and artistic traditions, and of course we'd want to see that expressed here.
Yes, here.
I'm not sure if you've read anything by Jeffrey Archer. Had a distinguished career, a chequered career, really, you could say, both as a politician and as an author. And quite a number of people I know who are very keen readers, including myself, are quite hooked on the Crofton Chronicles, which ran over about 7 volumes. And I remember asking a woman in Unity Books one day, now, have you got books by Jeffrey Archer? And she replied very smoothly. Or she said, we don't stock books by Jeffrey Archer. I just wonder if you've got any view on Jeffrey.
Well, I've read a number of his books, and he was pretty cool there for a while. Yeah, they're very readable. So in that sense, what I can say about him, and I'm jealous of him because he's able to write. And the political stuff, he's written a lot of political stories, and they're just so easy to read, and compared to the kind of stodgy stuff that me or others have tried. Again, the business of what's snooty and what's not was, I think, gets in the longer term gets kind of washed away by the power of the story. So if they're great stories, people will read them. It happens we have some stories that are extra well written and become part of the canon, and I think that's a great thing. It's a kind of cultural consistency. It's a sort of common base that a lot of people could connect to regardless of their background or political views or whatever. So he sells because he writes great stories. I don't know, is there a book series, a book of the Game of Thrones?
Yeah,
Is
sure
there books
is.
for it? Yeah.
He's got to start writing his next one because he's
See,
behind.
there you go. Those are complicated. I haven't actually followed it much, but the odd time I've seen it, you think, this is, a whole lot of kind of grey zone morality and politics, which I'm still can't quite understand why it's so popular. But isn't it great that an old-fashioned story is? And I always think it's great when you get this, when people see that the literature engages them in ways that make you think hard. So Jeffrey Archer is pretty straightforward. You enjoy the ride on the wave. But Game of Thrones is much more complex. It reminds me of listening to parables from the Bible as an adult. I've heard one, listening to one the other day, and they just suddenly seem so much more complex and, in that sense, engaging. It's not actually the same old story. There's dimensions to it you never saw before. So it's great to have that kind of new, broadly popular type of literature coming on the market.
And you?
As a country person, have you an opinion on Katherine Smith, Tutira?
Not particularly, no. You sound like you know more about it than I will. It's a book.
I'll ask another question. You were talking about the emphasis on story and also your Irish background. But the country hardly any bigger than New Zealand. And then it's won 4 Nobel Prizes in and I've got an Irish daughter-in-law, and the impression I get is that in Irish society there is great emphasis on the anecdote and the story, and when people want to make a point, 9 times out of 10 they will tell a story. Have you any comment on that?
Well, it's not. It hasn't been part of our culture, has it? In the same way, I might say we weren't proudly Irish. Just to tell you a little story about it, my mother in particular was not keen on the Irish, who she regarded as feckless drunks who didn't show up for work, went to the races too much. So it wasn't really till I was in my late teenage years that I found out for sure that after years of telling us her father ran a livery stable, his name was Mick O'Brien and he ran the Crown Hotel. So he really was Irish and had exactly that kind of, I never met the guy, but exactly that kind of gift. There's something about our, in New Zealand, encounter with the landscape, the rawness and the newness of it, where that we've been sort of much less articulate, but becoming more so. And I think the storytelling traditions of some of these other cultures, like the Māori and Pacific, are going to add to it. Because there's no doubt New Zealanders appreciate a great storyteller or a raconteur. I mean, we just had Boris Johnson here, and unfortunately we had to have a diplomatic meeting with him. I would have rather given him a couple of white wines and just listened for an hour.
Yeah.
Because I would have found out more about what's happening than I did from him struggling through the notes he was given, which he clearly didn't believe. So,
Well, on that note...
there was one down
there's
here.
one more, sorry. One more.
Oh, no, there it was. Yes.
If you could choose one book to give to the younger generation, which book would you choose and why?
Look, I honestly don't know the answer to that question because there isn't one book that's got the lot. I mean, in our culture, as it happens, the one kind of compendium of the most complexity and longest, deepest stories happens to be the Bible. Now, for most young people, that's got no relevance, and they don't refer to it. But from a purely literary point of view, it's a sort of an incredible treasure trove. So I just can't answer that question. I couldn't tell you one that I thought. It's an interesting question. I should ask my children. I mean, there's Catcher in the Rye was mentioned here. I still don't know what it is, what the magic is about that story, but every kid who reads it is affected by it. So I suppose that's it. If I thought the purpose was give them something that'll grab their attention and make them thirst for more, which is what you would want, then just on the basis of observation, that's the one I'd give them. There you go, there's an answer.
Okay, everybody, I'd like you to join me in thanking Bill English for this.